Hey everyone, it's Dr. Rick with a tutorial on leaky gut. Leaky gut is a street name for increased intestinal permeability, and I'll explain that in a second. If this is the first time you're finding me though, don't forget to hit the subscribe button somewhere down below and the alert button to find out when I do new videos. So, leaky gut doesn't just have to be from celiac disease where you're allergic to gluten. It can be from a lot of different sources. It can be from irritation from the food you take, bacteria in the food you eat, viruses from passing sick people, or sometimes even poisons, pesticides, chemicals, metals. So it could also be from stress. But all these things cause a problem with the gut not to function properly, and when the gut functions too fast or too slow, you have a problem. Eventually, when the lining gets irritated and gets sloughed off, meaning like when you have a cut and you peel off the top layer, you never heal up. Same thing with the lining of the colon. When it continues to lose its layer because things are moving too fast or the lining is bombarded with irritating things, then you will have poor absorption and your gut will leak. And this is how it happens. So these are enterocytes here, these things. It's like a cell. It's a single cell with a nucleus, and it has these little finger-like projections that point into the lumen. The lumen is the area in the gut that the food hangs out in. And believe it or not, the amount of surface area in the gut is about 1 to 2 times more than the entire skin. The entire skin as an organ. So the skin, you would think, has a lot of surface area, but the gut has more than that. So that tube that goes from your mouth to your esophagus, to your stomach, to the small intestine, to the large intestine, to your butt, that lining has more surface area than your skin. So it's important to know that this concept, because those of you who use cheap, when you're younger, you use cheap jewelry. Maybe you know this, if there's nickel in the jewelry, like in a watch, and you constantly are exposed to the nickel on the back of the watch, you'll have a reaction of the skin to the nickel eventually. And that's why cheap jewelry usually causes a reaction. So you try to spend on expensive jewelry because it doesn't have nickel. It's all gold or all silver. So the same thing that happens when you get exposed to something on the outside also happens on the inside. Remember, there's more. Your skin is supposed to, the skin out here is supposed to serve as a barrier to keep water in, to protect from bacteria and particles on the outside that you're exposed to, regulate your temperature. Same thing with the lining of the gut. It's supposed to allow nutrition in, bacteria out. It keeps it out, so you just poop it out, and bad things out. But sometimes if the lining is not intact, just like that cut in the hand, you can allow something to get into your bloodstream. So this is how it usually happens. So as I mentioned, the cells, these enterocytes, have these little fimbriae, and they allow, or they just wait for food to pass by. It actually starts as food, but it ends up as poop because you pull out through these little finger-like projections, you pull out anything that you want, usually carbohydrates, fats, proteins, minerals. Those are the building blocks you get from your food after you digest it properly. So you chew your food, you combine it with amylase, you break it down a little bit, and then you get your food into your stomach, and the stomach further turns a solid into a liquid so that the small intestine can suck up or absorb the cool stuff. Now, if you look here, these little finger-like projections, you also have a passage or an alleyway where the product, say the food, that's what this F is, the food or the macronutrients get into the bloodstream over here. This is all bloodstream. This is all where the lumen or lining, the inner side of your colon, your small intestine, your stomach is. This is where everything passes by. Essentially, this is a tube. It's a transit tube. And it just so happens that in the small intestine, you have these little things here that absorb nutrient. Now, the problem is you want to absorb the fuel, the food, but you don't want to absorb, this is a toxin, it's supposed to be a hazard sign, toxin, bacteria, virus, gluten, and this one here is called leptin. We'll talk about that later on, but all these things you don't want in your body. You want them to keep on going down, out into the colon and into the toilet bowl, the poop. The problem is sometimes some of these bad things, they have a way of getting into the cell. So these red lines that go between these enterocytes, that's supposed to be where you can get a block. And the problem is if this door, let's think of it as a door. If the door is not intact and it's open, like over here, the door is open, these guys will get in and into the bloodstream. You don't want these big particles into the bloodstream, but you do have a backup. So the backup is these T cells. T cells are attack cells. They're the immune response cells. They float around the body looking for a fight. They're the bouncers of the body. So when the bouncers find one of these guys, they call out the artillery. They call out for reinforcements. They attack on their own, but they call out reinforcements. Reinforcements are called mast cells. They just alert the entire immune system to attack anything that's trying to get in through the door that's not supposed to be open. Now here's what happens. Usually you'll have something they call a tight junction. So the tight junctions will only be open selectively. Now it's kind of cool because who found this was Alessio Fasano. Let's see. So Fasano was doing studies on Vibrio cholera. That's cholera. It's a bacteria that you get into your stomach, and it makes you essentially pour water out of your mouth and your butt. That's why it's called dysentery, almost like cholera dysentery, if you've heard of cholera in third world countries. Well, he was studying, he found that what happens with the bug that causes cholera is it learns to secrete something that stimulates something from the cell called zonulin. So when there's a bad bacteria, let's just go here, bacteria. When the bacteria comes in contact with the little finger-like projections, the enterocyte secretes zonulin. Zonulin comes out here and it breaks and opens the door. So it breaks the tight junction, opens the door, and then it allows everything to come in. So the enterocyte doesn't know that, but it's trying to react to either the bacteria or, in some cases, gluten. We'll talk about that and leptin later. But just for the sake of understanding how this leaky gut starts, usually it's a bacteria. It doesn't have to be cholera, but that was just the experiment found by Fasano to figure out, oh, there's these things called tight junctions that are supposed to be tight, but you can break them. So the cool thing is, no, it's not cool, but if you break these tight junctions in the small intestine and you allow bacteria to get in and bad things to get in and chemicals to get in, well, the body will attack and hopefully hold the fort so that not too much gets in, but these cells will react to what they're being exposed to. And there's something called mimicry, cellular mimicry, that if one of these cells looks like or resembles to the T cell, to the attack cell, the bouncer, if one of these cells looks like, say, a heart valve or a kidney cell or a joint, then the T cells, as they go around looking for a fight, if they don't find the bacteria or the virus or the chemical or the gluten, then the T cells will also attack things that look like these, and they'll attack your joints as far as arthritis. They'll attack your kidneys as far as like post-streptococcal, a streptococcal infection from group A, a certain bacteria will accidentally cause you to destroy your own kidneys. Or you've heard about how sometimes rheumatic heart disease occurs because you get an infection. Well, that too. In some cases, multiple sclerosis can be initiated, or Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis can be initiated by a bacteria as well. That's the theory. But that is, in a nutshell, how it happens. And it begins the process of a leaky gut, because you allow stuff to get in. You also, because the body's trying to protect itself, you also will lose a lot of water. And when you lose water and allow bad things in, your balance is off. So imagine a burn victim with just skin on the outside. If he's burned, say, all over his face or to 70% of his body, well, that burn victim will become dehydrated because you lose the barrier and you start to let go of a lot of moisture. That's why the burn victims have to be covered up and they have to drink a lot of water because they constantly lose. They lost their barriers, so they constantly lose humidity, water, evaporation. And so it's also important when these don't work, when the lumen is now broken and it lets things come in and lets water and precious things go out, you will also have an abnormality in electrolytes, minerals, food, fuel. So that's pretty much how the zonulin works against the lining. But important to note, zonulin also affects other tight junctions like the blood-brain barrier. So some people that have issues with leaky gut, they also have problems with brain fog. That's where you might have seen these books, Wheat Belly or Grain Brain. They talk about gluten being the source of all evil. And I do think gluten, especially in modern day bread and all these, anything that's made in a deli, not a deli, a bakery, sometimes uses a lot of gluten, and gluten's a very bad irritant. So here's, this is another article by Fasano, Alessio Fasano, and this is Davis's book on Wheat Belly. There's also Grain Brain by Perlmutter. Pretty good books, a little bit conspiracy theory, but if you are trying to figure out or get psyched up to stop gluten, you might want to read and see how the evidence, at least as far as the studies that these guys come up with, points to saying, please stay away from gluten because of all the problems, especially not only because you have this kind of a reaction, you incite a reaction, an inflammatory reaction after this stuff gets in. The inflammatory reaction causes a cascade and sometimes leads to arthritis, as I mentioned before, with attacking the joints, kidney disease, heart disease, or just skin disease like psoriasis, eczema, asthma even. And as I mentioned before, MS is even thought to be because of or related to a leaky gut. So it all starts because of something you got extra in your fuel or in your food. And nowadays, the food looks the same as before, but it is made differently. So you have a lot of extra things you don't want in there. You have enough exposure to multiple things all at the same time, you'll have an accumulated effect or a toxic burden that will really break down the lining. So that anything you don't want to absorb, you're going to absorb and you're going to have a side effect to it. I had a guy who had just tried a little magnesium in a leaky gut issue, and the magnesium, he said he became very dizzy with the magnesium, which shouldn't happen, but it got straight through the gut and went straight to his brain, and magnesium at high dose being exposed to the brain is supposed to be a little at a time. When you're hit and walloped because there's no barriers, it will cause a problem. So again, nice information if you want to read about gluten. I don't have my other book. This is just information on leaky gut. You can find a lot of great studies in the U.S. or outside the U.S. as far as tracking the effects of how data is accumulated to show you what happens when you have problems with your gut. I like Mullen's book on the inside tract, and it just reinforces the fact that in people with IBD or IBS, diarrhea dominant, you can find a relationship to the zonulin, the factor that gets released from the enterocyte when it's irritated. Well, I don't think it's a protective reaction. I think it's a reaction because of something causing the cell to release it. So it could be a bacteria, but I'll show you later on where the information is just robust with regards to the role of gluten. It's a perfect example. So again, more information. These are good. Zonulin upregulates or gets super sensitized in irritable bowel syndrome dominant diarrhea. There's IBS-C and IBS-D. IBS-C is constipation, IBS-D is diarrhea. Both are terrible to live with, but again, if you have IBS of any sort, you might want to read into or watch further. So Mullen's book's pretty decent. There are some recipes here. Also, it was forwarded by Andy Weil. Just to also make suggestions, this is a little bit tough to read. Dr. Campbell came up with this acronym called Gut Psychology Syndrome, or GAPS diet, And it's a little, it's okay, an okay book, but it was a little tough to read, almost like it wasn't edited properly, but maybe that's just because I'm used to reading the other books. Good information. Most of it points towards what you should be doing if you have a lot of stress in your body. So stress also increases the potential for gut to work and fire off too much. So if the gut's, you're supposed to eat something, you're supposed to digest it slowly, you're supposed to be able to get it to, after the stomach is liquefied all the solids, you're supposed to be able to get that to pass through the small intestine with all those finger-like projections to absorb every bit of fuel that you need and to get rid of anything you don't need. But the problem is when you are stressed out, anxiousness, depression, waves of bipolar disorder, you're going to have the mood from the brain affect the way the gut moves. So there's something called the vagus nerve. It goes down from the brain and it innervates. It's a long nerve. It innervates the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the colon. It's called the mesenteric plexus. But if your brain is firing off, it will fire off the entire 27 feet of the digestive tube. And you're not going to be able to digest properly. Everything will go too fast, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. When it goes too fast, you again, just because of the speed, you'll have the potential of irritating the lining because everything's passing through fast. Usually, everything that's undigested, so all the acid in the stomach that's supposed to be made, it might not be made, so you'll have solid material. And remember, the acid in the stomach is also supposed to get rid of some bacteria. So you'll have everything coming in solid with anything attached to it. And it just increases the chances for presenting bad stuff that got past the stomach into the small intestine, which is very, very delicate. The small intestine has a lot of blood vessels, has a lot of these finger-like projections, and on the finger-like projections you have microbiota, this mucus layer, it's called a biofilm, that contains the bacteria that's supposed to help you. There's actually more DNA in your small intestine and colon than there are, I should say, DNA, foreign DNA, than your actual natural DNA. So there's about 1,000 different species of bacteria that live in the colon, and the more robust or varied the different bacteria are of your microbiota, it's called, the better functioning your mood is, the better functioning you have of musculoskeletal rebuilding. Nutrition will also be playing a role in this. So all your other systems in the body, fight or flight, parasympathetic, neurological, cardiovascular, all depend on proper functioning of the colon. Even mood especially. Because there's more serotonin that's made in the cells of the small intestine there are in the brain. So when the small intestine is irritated, you usually have a problem with depression or anxiety. And when you just have a problem, when you have a good functioning colon, but you have a problem with depression or anxiety or stress reaction, that will again will upset the colon, so it's a bad vicious cycle. So anxiety, just if you like to, for you guys who like to read data, anxiety can lead to BDNF, that's brain-derived neurotropic factor, out of the brain, and it can increase the chances for IBS-D. This is just one where it talked about leptin. Sometimes you probably have seen it with regards to digestion, leptin and ghrelin, and sometimes increased leptin will also turn on IBS-D. Psychological stress also increases nerve growth factor, which again turns on IBS-D. So all these things play a big role with regards to how the colon works. So mood is very important. So those of you who don't want to see a counselor because you're stressed out but you don't want to see a counselor, it's very important to have mindful practice. That's why I always suggest exercise, nutrition, and mindful practice, in addition to proper sleep. So, while we're talking about stress, I thought because I do a lot of medical cannabis, I'd also mention that there are some studies that show that in some cases, medical cannabis can also control the gut microbiota. There are some studies that are a little limited, but they do say that people that take medical cannabis can significantly, well, the studies are wondering or postulating whether the cannabis causes CB1 stimulation and makes you drowsy, or if the bacteria in the gut are the things that make you drowsy. But there is a protective factor with regards to cannabis use and improving the way the gut functions. I thought I'd just throw that in because if you don't want to see a counselor, at least get the CBD going so that you have some form of calming. I mean, the best way to calm is actually to develop yourself. Calming practice brings out natural endocannabinoids. If you can't or don't want to get your own going with mindful practice, yoga, breath exercise, nature therapy, then if you eat it, and that's what I'm suggesting, I don't think you should be smoking it. If you eat it, or if you're eating it for cancer fighting and autoimmune fighting, I would say you should have calming practice with that, but always add your own calming practice. So, as far as leaky gut leading to other problems like multiple sclerosis or brain, I mentioned how the tight junctions also can affect the way the brain keeps things out, because the brain is very delicate and you don't want anything coming into the brain and irritating it. But sometimes these components will get to the brain and cause irritation. Again, grain brain or wheat belly. Those are specifically with regards to gluten. And Stephen Gundry is a cardiologist who talked to about leptins. And leptins and gluten, they're about the same. Leptins are they're old concepts, both of them, but leptins are not as well proven as gluten is, but still, they're both irritating things that come from plants. And sometimes you have to prepare the plants the right way. If you do have a leaky gut issue, or if you have an autoimmune issue, you probably should stay away from gluten, maybe even leptin. I'll talk about at the end. But sometimes if you do have problems with brain fog or multiple sclerosis, making a choice with regards to your food types can really turn around a lot of the inflammation. I know that people with multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease usually go straight to medicines because they're suffering so much, but sometimes in its infancy, when it's just starting, it would be great if you fixed the way the gut works. I think that most autoimmune diseases, that would be Hashimoto's thyroiditis, that would be rheumatoid arthritis, that would be Crohn's disease, psoriasis, I think all of them, in addition to multiple sclerosis, which is not really, well, it's kind of an autoimmune, I think all of them can be improved if you fix your diet. So I would stay away from the crappy stuff. For sure, dairy. I don't like dairy in my people who are suffering. If you can also do gluten withdrawal, great, but gluten is tough. Because you got to read everything, you have to be very knowledgeable. And this is where I think Stephen Gundry's stuff is good, the Plant Paradox. It is, he's pretty good. He just talks about, he has lists, and lists are easy. If it's dairy, it's easy. You just figure, avoid dairy as far as milk, cheese, yogurt, or ice cream. That's easy. You can kind of get those 4 products out of the way. You're going to miss them, and it's going to be hard, but they're very easy to find. Gluten is a little bit more difficult, especially if you eat out a lot. Very hard. It can be in soy sauce, it can be in your foods, it can definitely be in your breads. There are certain grain products that are okay. This is Acacia. Acacia is a nice bulker. If you have issues with constipation, if you have issues with high cholesterol, Acacia is a very good fiber that does help. Millet also is a good thing to have. And quinoa too. These are gluten-free, but they are fibrous. So if you're wanting a taste of fiber, you can certainly use those things. I believe I have videos on fiber. I'll put the links down below, where I also use Organic India psyllium husk as far as how to lower cholesterol and also get your colon moving. So this is a good point, because if you do take a probiotic, again, the gut can protect itself if it has enough of a strong microbiota, a strong assembly of different bacteria. Because if you have one bad bacteria or one bad virus, if there's or a parasite for that matter, if you have say 1 million or 1 billion bacteria in your microbiota, all that foreign DNA that's in your gut, they'll work to protect you. It's a commensurate relationship. So we house and have microbiota in this biofilm, and you have to have mucousy foods to have a biofilm. What are the mucousy foods? These things. So those of you who are carnivores, you might be missing out, or full keto without any veggies, you might be missing out because you might not have enough of the fibers to make the mucousy layer. That's called prebiotics. If you don't have any prebiotic, you won't have any biofilm, and that means there's no house for the bacteria, your microbiota, your probiotics to stay. If there's no probiotics, you're just opening yourself up to all this damage. So this one here is also from Now Foods, and it's probiotic with prebiotic. The prebiotic here is xylo-oligosaccharides. So this is pretty good. It's a powder, but if you wanted to take probiotic and prebiotic, this is prebiotic in a powder. But these are all prebiotics. In fact, I was taught at the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine, there's something called orthomolecular mucosagen. And it's a great thing that will help line the stomach, the small intestine again. DGL helps line the stomach with mucus. That's deglycerated licorice. Marshmallow root, slippery elm, in some cases aloe. It all works to give you a slippery coat so that you'll have a house for the bacteria to stay. If it's all dry, then you'll have a lot of problems with no bacteria being able to be adhered to. You want good bacteria. You don't want bad bacteria. Here's a whole bunch of bad stuff. So again, if you have a lot of good stuff, it'll outnumber the bad stuff. You'll just because of the fuel sources are not going to be there, the good guys will win, the bad guys will die. But if you have a leaky gut, again, the first concept is to shade or patch up the holes. And if the holes are because of food, stop your allergic food or intolerant foods. And some of you might not be tested positive for gluten, but you might still be intolerant to gluten. Some of you, and there's no test for leptin yet, but some of you will be very intolerant to leptins. Some of you will be very intolerant to dairy. You don't have to have an allergy, just as long as you have an intolerance to it, stop it. If you stop it, because there's a lot of other foods out there, you just have to learn how to provide and cook perhaps, or make your choices properly. A lot of good stuff that's out there. The more you process, if you don't cook, the more processed food you eat, the more out of control you are with regards to these things, these chemicals. And chemicals can really destroy the lining, so you have to be careful. Remember, when those chemicals destroy the lining, those chemicals head up to the brain and they'll affect the way the brain works. Which is why I, again, bring up the Wahls Protocol. So Terry Wahls is a MD, and she has multiple sclerosis. And in her book, she talks about vegetables, meats. Essentially, she talks about eating a certain amount of cups per day of veggies. And if you're going to eat a meat product, it should be everything, not just the muscle, which is what most people like, steak muscle, but you have to eat everything from nose to tail. If you eat everything in the animal, it will actually give you a better, well-balanced diet. So, and she reversed her multiple sclerosis with diet, which is outstanding. But the book's pretty decent. It has a couple of literature pieces that are pointed out. And there's also, again, very important information about saturated fats, that you can look these up on your own. Other things in the dietary change. I think I used a lot of these in the past from my previous videos, especially with the fasting mimicking diet and its reversal. I'll put a link down below for that video, how diet can help take care of autoimmune disease, which specifically the multiple sclerosis. And I commented in my video, neurologist told my patient, well, multiple sclerosis isn't related to food. And I just showed you in the video how it is related to food. So finally, there's not only just, we talked about bacterias, toxins from pesticides and from phthalates and from mercury or metals. I also talked about viruses and gluten, but now we're going to talk about leptins, because that seems to be a hot button ticket as far as another source of irritant. And I think I like this because I like Gundry's work because it makes it very easy. He puts it into essentially a list of things to avoid. So the question is whether lectins, that's lectins, and I think you can see it here, lectins, whether lectins can cause the same problem as gluten, because gluten or gliadin has been well documented. But now hopefully information will be released slowly as lectins become more of a popular, I can't say fad elimination diet, but because people are having problems with getting gluten out, maybe and gluten is a lectin too. So maybe the listing of lectins that Gundry has in Plant Paradox might make it easier for you if you're doing an elimination diet. Either way, I think it's worth a consideration. I haven't finished this book yet, but I usually refer to it just because its list is a lot easier. So that is what leaky gut is kind of about. There also is something called small intestine bacterial overgrowth. And as I mentioned, there's supposed to be bacteria all in here, in the biofilm. Sometimes when you have too many bacteria, because most of the bacteria are supposed to be in the large intestine, when you have the small intestine with too many bacteria, that also, because of the sheer number, will make it irritating, especially if you don't have that mucousy layer. So sometimes you have to have the right bacteria shocked into your community. I call the gut bacteria a city, and the city always has its designated workers. It has workers that go out at night to fix the roads. It has police officers that go out during the day to patrol and make sure things are good. It has its workers during the day to take care of City Hall. So different bacteria perform different functions. Some of them take care of mood, some of them take care of rebuilding muscle, some of them take care of supporting the brain, some of them take care of supporting the glands. Some of them help rebuild the colon and the small intestine. So the better you have of a wider variety of probiotic that you take, and that's why I take a new probiotic every 3 months. Because if you keep on taking the same one day in, day out, 365 days a year, well, when the city, the microbiota, the city allows, just think of it this way, the city will allow immigrants to come in one at a time. When you take 3 bacteria or 4 bacteria out of your probiotic and you just take them for 3 months, the city will allow 2 of those bacteria to come on in. And if you keep on taking the same probiotic, you've already let those 2 bacteria come in. You're not going to get anything more. That's how I think of it. So I like to change up the probiotic every 3 months so that new bacteria are going to be interviewed or vetted so that they might get into the probiotic city. Maybe they won't. But if you keep on mixing it up, I bet you what will happen is, depending on how you keep records, I like to keep journals, every 3 months you might have a change in your stool or change in behavior, or change in the way you exercise or respond to exercise or stress. So you can dial in the best probiotics if you keep a record. And again, changing every 3 months, awesome. If you do have a leaky gut, you might want to take the spored probiotics, and I have a video on that too. I'll put it down below. Those are ones that are built to make it through the hostile environment and then open up in the colon. They're a little expensive, but it might be worth it. If you don't have leaky gut, never mind. If you're watching this for a friend, that's fine too. You don't have to take all this expensive stuff. But I think there are some mouse studies where they take obese mice, they take the poop out of the obese mouse, put it into a skinny mouse, and because the skinny mouse now has the bacteria from the colon of the fat mouse, the skinny mouse becomes fat just because you change the microbiota. So and then backwards too. If you take the stool from a skinny mouse, put it into the fat mouse loses weight. Because the microbiota, the assortment of different bacteria, can control the way metabolics work. Even the cannabis can control the way, well, cannabis is supposed to help the microbiota too, but it can control how your body metabolizes fat. So it's really cool. Again, I just mentioned that because it's an extra thing that I do. I love talking about it. But so for the most part, that's how leaky gut usually starts with some form of trauma. And if you follow the paper trail, a lot of the autoimmune diseases that I just mentioned before have a basis on some infection or some poison or some event of gastroenteritis or some injury or some stressor, losing a parent. Something happened that usually triggers the issue. Whether it's multiple sclerosis or psoriasis or brain fog, there's always going to be something. That's why it's really important when I see people to take down a very full history, an integrative medicine history, because usually the patient will have the story and the patient will have the answer. It's just up to the doctor to pull out the answer from the patient and show them, see, this is what I mean. If you just fix this, then you should be able to fix your symptoms. If you can't, I have seen some GI specialists go straight to FODMAPs. This is tough. But sometimes if the gut is so irritated that you can't even, you're losing weight, you're cachexic, life is bad, it might have to get to the FODMAPs. This is not sustainable. It's really hard. But sometimes that's what you can go with. I mean, that's all you can go with. But most important, I guess, in all this theory of leaky gut and side effects and possibly related to chronic inflammatory disease, it's most important to at least get the help of somebody that's good, and that could be a GI specialist or a primary care doctor that's trained in integrative medicine. So to find your somebody that can help at least captain your team, you should be able to improve. It's going to take a lot of back and forth, a lot of learning, a lot of experimenting with probiotics and different food types, but you'll eventually be able to get to that point where the gut is improved. I think by using the authors I just mentioned below, you at least should be able to, you don't have to read all these things, I like reading them, but you should at least be able to come up with a stepwise approach. You do this for a while, then you do this next, and you do this next, and you continue to get better. If it fails, then you start from the drawing board and start all over again, but you still have a plan. Because this can get bad. You can see how the enterocyte is worn away and there's essentially no enterocyte anymore. There's no fimbriae. That means you're not going to be able to absorb any nutrient. You just absorb, you'll get the nutrient coming down the alley, but you'll also get all the bad guys and you'll just be so inflamed that you won't be able to use or utilize the nutrient. So reestablishing these tight junctions can happen. Reestablishing the brain's tight junctions can happen, but it usually takes figuring out what the trauma was. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea about how you can empower yourself and get past the problems. Maybe being picky with what you buy, what you eat, but most of all starting with the history from a good doctor. So thank you for watching until this point. If you have any comments, put them down below. Share this with somebody else who's trying to fight leaky gut. Otherwise, I'll see you at the next tutorial.